All right, it looks like we've got a good number here, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, welcome. My name is Jennifer Morell. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Elections Group. I know we have many repeat participants, but for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, the Elections Group partners with state and local election officials to implement new programs or improve processes for voters and stakeholders. We provide guidance, resources, and direct management support for state and local jurisdictions. And our team is made up of all former election officials and election experts from across the United States. We're so pleased to have you all with us today as we discuss tips and best practices for successful pre-election testing of your election systems. I'm joined today by one of our senior election experts, Matthew Talahaj. And we've placed a link in the elections to the Elections Group new guide that we'll be discussing today. That should be in the chat shortly, so you can all follow along at home. Okay, this is an exciting subject, so let's get started. Recognizing the importance of election system testing, several years ago, we published a logic and accuracy testing guide. It provided a fairly comprehensive set of steps and instructions, and it was meant to augment the testing process that's outlined by your individual voting technology providers. And this guide is still available on our website, and we encourage you to reference it as well. That guide was dense. It was almost 40 pages. And it also didn't provide a lot of thought for the interoperability of systems. So we've created a new guide. It's called Pre-Election Testing of Election Systems. And it really focuses on the fundamentals. And I think this is especially helpful for election officials who are maybe conducting testing for the first time. It highlights the ins and outs of best practices surrounding logic and accuracy testing, but it also looks at other testing of other components of your election system. Many of you in this webinar today, I know, understand that pre-election testing plays an important role in the safety, the security, the accuracy of our elections, and it's a critical component to ensuring the most transparent of processes. We know that election officials rigorously test voting equipment, ballot printing systems, electronic poll books, and even ballot delivery systems before the election. And we know that pre-election testing can be a tool to help educate the public about the layers of security built into your systems so that voters and stakeholders can have confidence in the process. And we'll be walking you through parts of our guide that cover these things. But before we get started, let me just highlight some of the biggest takeaways from this updated document, because we know some of you drop before we get to the end of the webinar. Matthew's going to cover a couple of really critical things. First is making sure you set aside adequate time and human resources for that testing cycle. Thinking about how you might develop a plan for testing all of your systems, and then testing the interoperability of those systems. When we get towards that, when we get through that, I will take it and spend a little bit of time talking to you about communicating your testing process with the public and the media. So talking about the public demonstration or public testing that you do, and ways that you can make that process transparent and encourage participation or observation. So with that, as an introduction, Matthew, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Happy to be with you folks today and look forward to sharing some information with you. Some of the information we're about to share is obviously information that you're well aware of, but for those of you who may be new kind of to elections, especially, we want this to hopefully be helpful to you as not only new information, but information that hopefully you'll expand upon and learn more about in the weeks to come. So it's that time of year that testing is getting planned and prepared for and about to take place. So hopefully this is a poignant topic. So let's dive into our presentation, and I'll let you know what we're going to start with today. So today's presentation, what we'll explore, we'll start with some testing basics, as Jennifer mentioned, but we'll also want to cover two important topics, and that's system interoperability and end-to-end testing. System testing best practices, we have several of those we'd like to share with you. And as Jennifer mentioned, we're going to talk about performing public tests and communicating about testing. We already dropped the link to this guide in your slide deck, or pardon me, in the chat, but we also have a QR code if you'd like to take a picture of this to get to the guide, something you can look at on your phone. Maybe you're traveling, maybe you just have a few minutes, you want to take a look at it. Hopefully you'll find it to be helpful. It's got a lot of resources and tips in there for you folks to consider. So what is pre-election testing? Well, first of all, we want to just start by thinking of all the systems that you use out there. Now, we're using the word systems to kind of highlight those technologies that you use for your operations. Could be your ballot printing system that maybe stands alone from other systems. Sometimes the ballot printing system is connected maybe to the electronic poll book system, but also the big system that's out there is that voting system that all of us have. Most of us have electronic poll books, so that's another system. Of course, there's that really important system that you have, a voter registration system. Some of you have like a standalone product. Some of you use software that's provided by the state. But either way, that's a system that's out there. So when we think about the systems that are out there and you look at the screen here and you see several of the systems listed, think about which systems you use that are missing from this list. And then think about what you do to test both the software and the hardware that operates that system. Anytime something changes in your systems, it's really important to test. But it's also important, obviously, to test these processes and these systems before each election. One example that I share when I talk about this topic, and I'll share it now, is back in the day, we needed to put in paper for our DS, well, it was M100s at the time. So we did load the M100s with paper, and at the end of the night, we'd print a results tape. In the morning, we'd print a zero tape. Well, if you don't put the right paper in there, the paper is not going to print. But one of the small things that's out there that we might take for granted is making sure, for example, we have the right paper that's loaded into the machine. In this case, we didn't use thermal paper, therefore the printer didn't print properly. But those are things we sometimes take for granted, thinking that it's going to work as it worked before, when really it's not something that will work if it's not tested and you don't take the time to make sure it's going to work in advance. So just an important thing to think about for all of your systems. Are there software and hardware tools that you use out there right now that may not be subject to as thorough testing should be prior to each election? So historically, we talk about testing of voting systems, and we often refer to that as logic and accuracy testing. But technology has kind of redefined what it means to test before an election day due to the introduction of the various systems that you use that aren't necessarily a voting system. Case in point, your electronic poll book system. So before the advent of some of these technological advances, election officials primarily focused their testing on the voting equipment, which is used to obviously process votes, and the tabulation system, which is used to count those votes. So this testing became known as what we all often refer to as LNA testing or LAT. Whatever you call it, logic and accuracy testing is typically what we call the testing of our voting systems. When we think about logic and accuracy testing, think about it. Why do we call it that? Well, the logic behind the logic and accuracy testing, the logic testing ensures that a vote cast for a particular candidate or option is correctly recorded and then tallied for that candidate or that option that's chosen in the case of like an issue. In other words, a voter's selection for candidate 1 is tabulated as a vote for candidate 1, while a voter's selection for candidate 2 is tabulated as a vote for candidate 2. So when we think of logic and accuracy testing, that's the logic end of it. The accuracy testing verifies that the voting system accurately counts those votes. The system is often tested by feeding a known set of inputs, such as a predetermined set of ballots that are pre-marked, and then checking those outputs, the vote counts, to ensure that they match the expected results exactly. So when we refer to logic and accuracy testing, that's what we're talking about. another QR code. We already dropped the link in the chat to this, but as Jennifer mentioned, we do have a guide out there. It's got a lot of information in it, but feel free to take a look at that as you think about testing that you'll be performing here in the near future. So we couldn't come up with a fancy name for the pre-election testing of the other systems that are out there. Obviously, we refer to testing of voting systems often as logic and accuracy testing, but we just use the generic term of pre-election testing to refer to testing of other systems that are out there. So, for example, when we think about testing of a voter registration system, for an election purpose, we're talking about those exports that are imported into other systems, the imports that might come from other systems, such as like a candidate filing system, or maybe it's an absentee system that's connected to the VR system. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about voter registration. When we think about electronic poll books, when we think of testing, we're talking about testing to make sure, for example, any access cards are programmed correctly, that whatever communication network that might be used to sync or transmit information between the individual poll book units to the central processor, to the central server, are working correctly. And also to make sure if there's interconnectedness between electronic poll books, that they are functioning together. For example, if you're using a vote center type setup, then someone can go to any check-in table to make sure those electronic poll books units are actually syncing together. And then we think of pre-election testing of ballot printing systems, obviously making sure that the ballots are printed accurately, that they coincide with the ballot styles that need to be generated, but also that those ballots are scannable. Remote ballot marking system and delivery system, many jurisdictions use those systems. We'll talk more about this in a little bit, but those are items that need to be tested before each election, as well as our election results reporting system. And we'll talk a little bit more about some best practices a little further on in the presentation. So let's jump into the testing basics. And what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is really cover a lot what's in the pre-election testing guide. First of all, I just want to remind everybody that system vendors are just a valuable resource for logic and accuracy testing, but also pre-election testing. And they will provide guidance on how to conduct the various testing of your systems. And we strongly urge you to incorporate this guidance into your testing materials. But just want to make a note that testing is the responsibility of election officials. So while vendors can provide assistance and certainly even provide some manpower to get the job done, it's up to the election officials to oversee and really evaluate the testing process to ensure it's done accurately and completely. So just want to make that note. A lot of us in various spots in the country depend highly on our vendors. We need their assistance and they're a valuable tool, but want to keep that in mind. So hopefully you thought a little bit about the various systems that you have out there and have thought a little bit about what systems you currently test prior to each election. So that's the first thing, to identify all of the systems that are out there that you use and think about how you test those systems prior to each election. Here's a system that we don't maybe think a lot about, but for example, a lot of us use mail processing equipment to receive in mail ballots, and then ultimately to like open them up to make sure that the ballot can be extracted and those sort of things. One thing that came up recently in conversations was what happens if you, for the first time, have a multi-page ballot? Well, it's a good thing to think about. Will the system work the same if the envelope's thicker? Will the slicer work the same way? So testing those variables that may occur for this type of an election, being a presidential election, is really important as you think of all the various systems that you use. Next slide shows the next step in the process. It's to really develop a test plan. Creating this plan allows you to document each phase of the process. And this is really important because ultimately you want a structure behind your testing. You want to make sure that you're evaluating each stage of the process to make sure that it's being done thoroughly. We have here on the screen just a quick diagram outlining the stages involved. Once the election definition file and the setup of the ballot management system is complete, and the ballots are proof, what the next steps are going to be in that testing process. So as you consider your various systems, obviously this is kind of outlining a voting system test plan, but think of your other systems and create a similar test plan to ensure that you're properly testing those systems prior to each election. Next slide shows a timeline. Obviously, each jurisdiction, depending on the state law or depending on the timing, the testing time frame is going to vary. So it's important that you look at your election calendar and blocking that specific time when logic and accuracy testing must take place. This timeline considers, again, once again, the voting system itself, but this would apply to all of your various systems. You'll need to determine when you're going to actually perform your testing and make sure that you have the necessary staff available to perform those tests. And one thing just to keep in mind is it's always a good practice to have some built-in buffer time in case anything changes. For example, what happens if you conduct your logic and accuracy testing because you have to, it's getting down to the wire, but then something changes. Maybe a candidate is added to the ballot, or there's some kind of court order which determines that somebody needs added to the ballot or an issue needs added to the ballot. Allowing yourself those times to adapt, as election officials do really well, to a dynamic time frame is important. So think about your calendar, your elections calendar, all the different deadlines, all the different time frames that are there, and make sure you plan successfully to allow adequate time for your testing of your election systems. On the next slide, wanted to just suggest something to everybody, and that's that before you jump into testing the actual equipment, it's really important and helpful to perform a small but thorough end-to-end test on just a subset of the equipment. It says voting equipment here, but it should really apply to all your equipment. So this would apply to your electronic poll book units, your ballot printers, etc., the equipment that's used in the field. And the next slide just kind of outlines how this would work with the voting system. So what I'm recommending is that you would load your election definition file into the ballot printing system if you have one, print a small test deck for 3 to 10 precincts or ballot styles. You would then hand mark those ballots using a test script. So the test script is what the outcome is going to be. Step 4 would be to load that file to the scanners and ballot marking devices. Run your 0 reports, scan the test deck through the scanners that you use, mark your ballot marking devices accordingly. And step 8 is then print reports on each unit tested. Ultimately, you'd close the units and remove the memory devices, process those memory devices, verify that all the election system components, such as your ballot replication and adjudication applications, are working correctly, print and review the reports from the election management system, and then ultimately verify the accuracy of the reports against the test deck results. Why do this? Well, if you start small, you avoid those bigger issues of having to redo a test deck, or having to redo the entire test on all the equipment. It allows you that opportunity to evaluate more closely a smaller subset to identify any issues that may come up, whether it's a programming issue, whether it's a reporting issue, whatever it might be. It allows you some more time to make a change before you've already started the ball in motion. So just something to consider. It may not be possible for every jurisdiction if you don't have, for example, a ballot printer to be able to print those ballots, but some smaller subset of testing is always recommended for this process. On the next slide is just a really important tip for everybody. To document and record your process of testing, make sure you utilize a checklist. This is really essential for your staff as well, so that everyone's following the same routine of testing, making sure that everyone's following the necessary steps that you expect to be conducted during your test on each piece of voting equipment. So if you don't already have a checklist, I would recommend contacting your colleagues who may have similar systems that are in play and use, see what they have, borrow from other folks. We also have resources on our website sample checklist that we'll be providing that you can take and steal from as well in order to make sure that your checklist is as comprehensive as possible. And one important suggestion is to make sure that you're incorporating any guidance from your vendors. They may already have a checklist in place, so use that in addition to any other testing requirements that you may have in your own office. So those are just the basics. Next, we'll jump to the interoperability of systems, and I'll explain a little bit more what that means. So as we go to the next slide, notice that interoperability testing is really kind of shown here between an electronic poll book and a voting system. So what we want to discuss is the importance of ensuring that the data that comes, for example, from a voting system is matching what's maybe in the electronic poll book. So for those who use, for example, a printed barcode to activate a voting session of a marking device, or use information to program an access card in order to pull up the ballot style, it's really important that the two data points are matched up to ensure that everything's working accordingly. I'll kind of provide a real life example of why this is so important. In my experience, there's been some times where electronic poll books would be loaded with information, and there would be some testing that happens. But what ended up happening in one situation was the ballot style information loaded into the electronic poll book didn't relate exactly to the ballot styles that were loaded or created through the voting system. So what ended up happening was, for example, somebody in precinct 6 was actually getting a precinct 7 ballot when they used the barcode to activate a voting session on the ballot marking device. Therefore, they were actually voting the wrong ballot. And as you can see, that was early on in the precinct numbering. And if you have 800 precincts, that means that a lot of voters may end up receiving the wrong ballot. So fortunately, there are workarounds. There are things that can be done to correct this issue. But this was a problem that was experienced and probably could have been caught if the thorough interoperability testing was performed to ensure that every ballot style was correctly reflected when pulled up on the ballot marking device. And this is time consuming. It's going to take more energy. It's going to take more personnel and staff to perform, but really thinking about how important this is and building in time into your time frame to allow for interoperability testing in general. So in the diagram, what we're showing is that the electronic poll book will print a barcode with ballot style information to start a voting session. And that ballot style information actually comes from the voting system and must match what's in the electronic poll book. So those two data sets must match, and that must be part of the testing overall. So there's other systems that are out there that relate to one another. For example, the electronic poll book system and the voter registration system. The voter registration system is often used to import a file that loads into the electronic poll book. So if you have, for example, 1,000 voters loaded into your electronic poll book system from the VR system, there should then be 1,000 voters in the electronic poll book system. So these data checks are an important part of your testing process. Obviously, there's also a relationship between your ballot printing system and your voting system, because the PDFs that are often loaded into a ballot printing system are generated from the voting system itself. The ballot printing system and electronic poll book system often have a relationship because the electronic poll book system is used to actually generate a ballot from the ballot printer. So making sure you test the interoperability of those systems is really important. So there might be other systems that are in play that you utilize that have an interoperability or an exchange of information between that system and another system. So just make sure that you're building in time to test those and the interoperability of those systems. So why is interoperability testing so important? I think a lot of it's kind of self-evident, but keep in mind that a change to one system may impact the function of another system. So, for example, if you've updated your voting system firmware or software to a new version, that version may have changes in it that impact how the electronic poll book perhaps the access card is actually programmed. Maybe it requires new security codes, maybe it requires other information, and it may not work the way it did in the last election. So those are important reasons to test the interoperability. But really, the interoperability testing ultimately will provide you with the confidence that the process will run smoothly and avoid those issues, as I mentioned in that example, where the ballot styles were pulling up incorrectly for each voter. That creates a lot of problems, especially early in the morning, but also in general just causes a lot of confusion, and something that can be avoided with proper interoperability testing. Next, I just want to jump on the bandwagon here of end-to-end testing, and I'll explain that on the next slide. So what is end-to-end testing? Well, that's just a process of testing that mirrors real-time system usage and evaluates outcomes at each stage of the process. This really allows for you to kind of rehearse the real thing. One of the positives of performing end-to-end testing is it really does allow you and your staff to work out how things are going to actually happen. For example, on election night, when results are maybe being transferred to the office through a direct import or maybe through a secure modem process, how you're going to take that information, how you're going to tabulate those votes. It allows you folks to kind of rehearse the real thing during the end-to-end testing process. Let me illustrate this on the next slide a little better for us. Again, using voting systems as the systems that we're testing. This little flowchart shows all of the steps that would be involved into what we would consider an end-to-end test. It's similar to kind of what we've already covered, but notice how we go through steps like performing the necessary adjudication, testing that. That's something that's going to happen when you prepare for the unofficial results, and the official results are going to have to adjudicate ballots. Making sure that part of the system is working properly is really important, and sometimes maybe something that's not considered when going through the logic and accuracy testing process. Finally, it ends up with recording the seal numbers on the chain of custody documentation, making sure that we go from start to finish with our testing. This is just really a high level summary of what end-to-end testing consists of, but it really looks at every stage of the process. I'll give an illustration of why this is so important, and some jurisdictions using ballot marking devices may have experienced this, where, for example, the response text, like the yes, no, or for and against text, was actually printing different on the ballot cards that are generated from the ballot marking devices than expected. So for example, let's say on the screen, the choices were yes and no, which matched the actual printed ballot, but on the actual card itself, it said for and against. Those are things to consider as part of the end-to-end testing, that you're actually looking at all of the reports, all of the ballot cards that might be generated by ballot marking devices to make sure that the choices that are printed on those cards match what's on screen. And we've noticed that sometimes the length of certain offices need to be abbreviated on those ballot cards. Making sure that information is correct is all a part of the end-to-end testing. Next slide just shows the reason for it. End-to-end testing allows for a really thorough test. It allows for multiple levels of review, and it also mirrors, again, that actual usage. So going through the exact same steps that you would go through in a live environment for each election. All right, finally, I'll wrap it up with some best practices. I would just encourage you folks now, if you have some best practices that apply to these different systems, maybe it's something that you've discovered along the way, go ahead and put that in the chat. Also, if you have any questions that correspond to this section, please go ahead and share those questions, and we'll get to those as we go through the presentation. Focus on voting system testing here. Just a couple of quick best practices to share with you here. This is really important, obviously, but sometimes we take it for granted, especially if there's staff turnover and different folks that might be performing the supervisor role in an election office. It's important that you understand the rules and the laws in the state surrounding testing. Often states have certain specific rules for maybe how the test deck must be created. For example, a lot of us create a test deck, or a lot of election officials will create a test deck with like a 1-2, 1-2 type pattern. For example, the first candidate on the ballot will receive 1 vote. The second candidate will receive 2 votes. The third candidate might receive just 1 vote. And maybe state law requires you to do 1 vote for the first candidate, 2 votes for the second candidate, 3 votes for the third candidate, 4 votes for the fourth candidate. So those types of situations may be in play in your state, and it's just important that you understand what rules are in place. If you're new to, elections, and maybe this is the first time you're going through the LNA process, I would encourage you to contact colleagues nearby, folks that have maybe some more experience operating LNA testing, and ask them what they do to ensure that all the processes are being followed, or contact the state directly to get guidance if needed. Another topic that's been floating around for several years now, but really kind of an important portion of especially logic and accuracy testing, is to randomize your test script. What we mean by that is oftentimes the test deck is automatically generated by the voting system. But some jurisdictions have for several years now used randomized testing, maybe in addition to the pre-programmed results that are created from the test deck that's generated by the voting system. But randomizing and injecting those into the test so that it requires more of a visual review to ensure that the test deck itself matches the results that came out, because they might not be an expected result. You have to kind of determine that everything's done correctly. It really kind of allows for and kind of an independent test in a way to ensure that the equipment is working exactly the way you would expect it to. So if random marking is done by hand, it's important that you proof the set to ensure that every selection has been marked on at least 1 ballot. Randomized marking is something that most folks would find to be pretty time consuming, but it just really helps to bolster your testing process. So encourage folks to explore that. Also, really important that you test all of your equipment. Even if you know that you're not going to immediately deploy that specific unit, it's important that it's tested, even if it's not kind of allocated to a certain location for use in the election. It may be that you'll need to deploy that, so make sure it's tested and ready to go. And make sure that you're including all of your ballots in your testing process, including those used on election day. Oftentimes, those ballots will come several weeks before election day. If you're a jurisdiction that has pre-marked ballot, or pardon me, pre-printed ballots, you want to make sure that those are incorporated into the test to ensure that they're cut properly, to ensure that they're going to be fed into the scanner properly and tabulated as expected. And then make sure that you're verifying throughout your testing that all the security controls are in place. Just an important reminder that it's really crucial that you reset all your administrative passwords from election to election, and making sure that those are working properly if they're needed to access different components of the voting system for an election. Next, let's go to electronic poll book system testing. Just a couple of reminders here. Make sure your data is accurate. For example, the voter count must match the voter registration system if you're using the VR system to import data into the electronic poll book system, and really verify that your counts by precinct split, and by voter status match. Make sure that all your check-in functions match the expected outcome. For example, if there's rules in your state that maybe the person might not be living at that address that's in the electronic poll book, that the system's configured in such a way to inform the user of what they need to do, what steps they need to take to provide that voter with the proper instructions or with the proper ballot. As we kind of covered already, ensure that your correct ballot style information is generated on each access card or the printed barcode that may be used to activate a ballot session. And again, make sure your permissions, your privileges are set up properly in your electronic poll books. Make sure, again, it functions as expected and that any reports produced validate the testing. So for example, if you're processing, let's say, 5 check-ins on your electronic poll book, make sure that your reports demonstrate that you've also checked in 5 voters. And as we already mentioned, make sure you're testing your interoperability between the electronic poll book systems and any systems that it may be touching. Next, let's just touch on ballot printing system testing. Most of this is something you already do, but want to ensure that the quality of the ballots is correct, that it's working properly. You'll want to test by scanning those ballots and ensure that each ballot style prints as expected. For those of you using remote ballot marking systems or remote ballot marking and delivery systems, you want to make sure that you're testing the function and usability of those systems, proof the ballot styles, and ensure that the system is accessible. You may want to partner with an organization who can test those systems from time to time to ensure that they're working as expected, and verify that the ballot can be accessed, marked, and delivered properly. So you want to test to ensure that it's working as expected. And for those of you who finally report election results through an election results system, ensure that your voting system export file is compatible with the reporting system. So part of that voting system end-to-end test would also probably include exporting a file and loading it into your ENR system to make sure that it accurately produces the correct data on screen for folks to see in kind of a real-time environment. When you do those tests, make sure that you're marking properly that it is a test, so you don't provide any confusion to the public when you load those results and test the reporting in the live environment. And make sure that you're testing any configuration settings and ensure that the database can handle the capacity. Obviously, a lot of folks are going to be driven to your website. And maybe if the election results reporting system is actually being hosted by a vendor in another manner other than use of your website, you want to make sure that those settings are correct and that you're allowing for the proper capacity to be handled when you report those results on election night and have higher traffic to that website. And finally, I've said finally twice, so apologies, but I'll wrap up with some key takeaways on the next slide. Just some things we've already covered, but make sure you develop a plan and process for your testing. Make sure you consider interoperability of your systems and that you perform an end-to-end test. Also, really important, train your staff that are involved in the testing so they're knowing the process in and out. Utilize that checklist and require sign-offs in the process. And make sure that you're retesting after any changes are made. That's a crucial part of being prepared for election day. And try not to, unless absolutely avoidable. Don't make hardware or software changes once your testing is performed unless absolutely necessary. So consider those things as well. If a change needs to be made, you will also have to be making time for a retest to take place as well. And thank you for your time. I will pass it along to Jennifer to talk more about performing a public test.
Awesome, Matt. Thank you so much. All right. So take a look at this picture. If you look at the picture on the left, this was me the first time I did a public test. Despite my team assuring me that no one would show up, I made them clean the office, tidy things up, print signs, carefully arrange our equipment, prepare some handouts. And as all of my fellow election directors and clerks in the county surrounding me did, I posted the statutorily required legal notice in the newspaper. And guess what? Just like a party of one, no one showed up. Fast forward from that first experience to my time serving as a deputy of elections in Colorado. And when I came there, one of the things I loved was that there was a culture that I inherited of really encouraging people to attend public testing. And I have to tell you and recognize when as I go through the slides and talking about best practices, it was scary. It was scary because I'd gotten used to what I previously described as the party of one, where we would notice the test and no one would come. Here we were not only putting out those required notices, but we were putting out information on our website, on our social media platforms. We were inviting a number of individuals directly. We'd send direct invitations and really trying to encourage the public to come and participate. What I loved about it, and the reason I decided to go with the party sort of theme or graphic here, is that in many ways, it was a celebration. It was a celebration up to that moment of all the planning and testing that we had done. And it was a way essentially to mark that from this point forward, we were in kind of a live election mode, right? All the equipment had been tested, prepared, sealed, and was ready to be deployed. So let's just take a step back and just talk for a minute about what is a public test. I know that many states require a public demonstration of the process used to test your voting equipment, but it is also an opportunity for the public to review the results of that test. The public test, or public demonstration, we like to call it, usually involves testing a smaller number of machines. The public demonstration normally does take place on a publicized date and time. And in many jurisdictions, they allow members of the public to come in and mark or scan test ballots. And the public test provides an opportunity not just to talk about your testing process, but really to explain prior to the election how all the voting equipment is physically and digitally secured. This is your opportunity to explain all the steps involved in ensuring ballots are accurately and properly counted. And I'll just add, the more genuine you can make this experience for observers, the more likely you will be to dispel inaccurate criticism. So we get asked a lot about when should the public demonstration take place. And bear in mind, I know in some states that is set in statute, and you can't differ from that. But ideally, you want to hold that public test or that public demonstration after all your equipment has been thoroughly tested by staff. That way, if you find an issue during that routine testing, you have to go back and reprogram something and retest equipment again. As Matthew kind of talked about, you want to wait until everything's been successfully tested and ensure all the equipment is functioning properly before you hold that public demonstration. It also means giving yourself time to print and review the results so that you can make those available during the public demonstration. Okay, so who should be involved? As I mentioned, all voters and interested stakeholders should be encouraged to attend your public demonstration. And as I illustrated with my example, in Colorado, you can do this by advertising on your website, on your social media platforms, by sharing it with interested groups. I would also encourage you to really think about how you might extend direct invitations to advocates in your community that support the work that you do. So think about inviting folks from the League of Women Voters, obviously your political party chairs. I know those were really important to me when I was doing this. Also candidates and ballot issue committees. You want them to feel confident about the process. They're on the ballot. They should be encouraged to participate in the testing. We also invited, I was a county director, so we invited city and town clerks to come and participate. Really anybody that may have some connection to the election that is happening. So a couple of things to think about in preparation, and I'll try to move through this list fairly quickly. But you don't want to overcomplicate it. The public demonstration should follow the exact same steps used during the official pre-election testing. The goal of the public demonstration is to explain the purpose of the testing and to demonstrate the process that you use during the official testing and to showcase the results. Some things you might want to add to your checklist, making sure obviously you choose a date and time and you follow your guidelines for publicizing that. Consider the room where that might take place. Your public demonstration may not be in the same facility where testing actually occurred. So think about a space that's large enough to accommodate the number of pieces of equipment that you're going to use, staff that may be assisting you with the public demonstration, and also the anticipated number of public members. So making sure you have plenty of space for people to sit. If you're going to allow them to scan and mark ballots, ensuring there's room for that, and making sure you've got any audio visual equipment if you're going to be doing a presentation. Do you think about how much equipment you want to bring out for the public test? Again, in many offices, you're testing hundreds of pieces of equipment. You may decide that much smaller number, a dozen, maybe less, maybe more, is adequate, depending on how many people come or how many people how big of space you have to accommodate that equipment and those individuals. One thing we think is really important, and we're going to show you some handouts and things that you can use in preparing a presentation and handouts, is to have a bit of a script ready. These can be one-page handouts or talking points that help you sort of convey to your audience, again, what testing is, what's happening, and why it matters. Also, make sure you've got enough blank test ballots and tally sheets if you're going to allow folks to mark during the public demonstration. And then this is a really good time to ensure your space is clean and orderly, that your work areas are well signed, you've got enough pages in your visitor's log, you've got enough visitor badges. We do have a link we'll post to our keeping ballots guide for keeping your ballots organized. That might be helpful as you're thinking about getting ready for that demonstration. This is one, and I'm going to show you a couple others. A handout that you might think about. It talks about all of those different testing components that Matt mentioned. It's customizable. You would want to change it to be the same as your jurisdiction's colors, add your logo, include pictures of your equipment, but it's an easy one-page handout that can allow the public sort of follow along. It might also be something that you use in designing your presentation, or simply use to keep your talking points clear and succinct. Next slide. Actually, we're going to skip this. Again, just making sure you have a plan, making sure you've got a checklist, just like for anything you do. Go into it knowing exactly what's going to happen and when, how much time you're going to allow, making sure you thought about how to handle questions, things like that. One thing we do want to note is that it can be a good practice, and in some places it is required by law to perform a post-election test of your equipment. In some places, even where it's not required, that's done as an additional way to check the voting system has not been tampered with. And we encourage you to chat with your vendor about this if this is a requirement in your state, but also take the opportunity, if that is your practice or a requirement in your state, to share that during your public demonstration. So I've got about 10 minutes left, and we've got all kinds of really amazing templates that I'd encourage you to use. Let me just add, so I don't need to repeat it as we go through these. These are all customizable. They're all meant, most of them are in the format of a Google slide, so that it's easy for you to move things around, move graphics or icons, change colors, change background colors, add your logo, change the wording so that it fits the processes and procedures that are in place in your own office. But we know that communicating how this pretty technical and sometimes complicated process can be. And so we've tried to create a number of things you can use to either bring to your public test or publish in some other way. So this first one is just a front and back page. Logic and accuracy testing protocols. It includes some examples of the types of equipment that's tested, so a glossary or vocabulary to help participants understand some of the terms that you're using, and then a really brief overview of the testing process. So this next set of slides that I'm going to show you, we refer to this as our security sandwich. And the reason we do that is, again, it's a customizable template. It's meant to showcase that testing, that this pre-election testing we're talking about is one component in this much larger set of things that we do to ensure the security and the accuracy of our elections. So it's sort of sandwiched in between those. This resource, again, we'll put a link in the chat. You can mix and match these things. You can use them in a slide presentation. You could create a report or a handout. You could turn them into posters or signs. Again, we've included instructions at the beginning of this guide when you go to it on our website to walk you through changing those colors and fonts and adding things so that it becomes your own. And sorry, one more thing on this. Just the sandwich part of this is meant to think about everything we do prior to an election, the things that are happening during an election, that includes the early voting period, and then all of the things we do post-election, our post-election practices. And I'll run through those fairly quickly. Okay, so pre-election, and this covers the voting system requirements. So this goes all the way back to the VVSGs and the system requirements created by the Elections Assistance Commission and the federal testing process. What I love about this guide is these are often questions that I know you get, and sometimes it's challenging to know how to answer them. You don't want to say the wrong thing. We spent a lot of time with experts in each of these areas to understand the technical components. And then we worked with our communication folks who are thoroughly grounded in plain language and tried to take the technical requirements and turn them into a phrase or two that was easy to understand for the public, but also to help you tell your stakeholders and voters why that particular security process matters, how that secures their vote. The election part talks about, and I realize we're missing a slide here that actually covers logic and accuracy testing. We'll get that added in. It is in the guide, so you'll see it there when you go to the full guide. The election part covers, this is really about chain of custody. We're talking about how once that equipment's been tested and sealed, how that is securely transported and delivered to polling locations or kept secure in your central facility. So again, it's a way to explain that. And then post-election, there are a couple of sections here that cover your tabulation audit. Again, we've created a very generic, generalized version of what takes place during the audit and how it secures your vote. You may want to tailor that a little bit to the particular audit practices in your state and jurisdiction. And then we end with the thing that sometimes we overlook, which is how all of that equipment gets securely stored and made ready for the next election. And then, yep, you're seeing the slide that kind of just gives you an explainer about how to use that. So really encourage you to use all of these graphics, handouts, slides for your public presentation as a way, again, to help explain the things that you're doing and in a way that's digestible and easy for folks to understand. Okay, we've got 5 minutes. Thanks for hanging in there with us. I'm going to just zoom through a couple other slides. So at the Elections Group, we're part of an initiative called the U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence that's thinking about excellence for election offices across a broad range of topics, including things like logic and accuracy testing. The Alliance is a nonpartisan collaborative. It brings together election officials to rally around a common set of values and standards, to support each other, and to keep their skills fresh. Election offices from around the country participate alongside designers and technologists and other experts. And we're doing all sorts of work, including building resources to support election offices. And I encourage you to go to the Alliance website and look at some of those resources. One critical part of that work is the standards for election excellence. They are a way for election offices to identify what excellence looks like across all parts of their work and to benchmark their efforts and build their office's capacity and to celebrate improvement. And so the standards cover a variety of topics relevant to election offices. So poll workers, communications, ballots and audits, security, voting operations, management, and leadership. And today we're going to give you a link in the chat. We want to give you the opportunity. We're doing a deep dive into the standard on ballot creation. This standard covers all the things related to the creation of ballots, including this very timely topic of logic and accuracy testing. And I will just note there are other standards in this category that cover topics like voting resource allocation, secure ballot management, tabulation audits, all of my favorite things. But today we just want to show the standard for ballot creation. So what is this? What does that mean? How do we define that? What does that look like? Your election office creates ballots that are well designed, accurate, and in formats that meet voters' needs. To achieve this standard, your ballot and ballot marking instructions use principles of plain language and information design across all ballot formats. You produce accurate ballots through proactive review and management of ballot printing, including in your vendor relationships. Your ballot proofing procedure ensures clarity and accuracy across all ballot styles, and your ballots are proofed by one or more proofers who did not design and program the ballot. You conduct logic and accuracy testing of ballot marking and tabulation equipment on all forms of ballots. Again, this standard has been put out for feedback, so really encourage you to take the opportunity, that link that's in the chat, and provide feedback to us and to the Alliance. Really would love to hear from you. We have spent time with many election offices, large and small, urban, rural, from all different parts of the country to inform these draft standards. But certainly look forward to hearing anybody that has strong feelings about the standard before we make it permanent. Okay, so we are out of time. I know we have some questions that, let's see, did not get answered. We'll try and reach out to you directly. Real quick, let's see. Elizabeth, thank you. These are great suggestions, especially the one about battery power. We will definitely make sure that gets added into the guide. I think we include some things about clearing out test data and personnel, but definitely that battery power is really important. Ned, yes, test decks are usually a combination of ballots from the election office. Sometimes they also can come from print vendors and jurisdictions that use those, and a combination of the two. And ePoll book testing, penetration testing, yes, that is routinely done on ePoll book Wi-Fi network. So yeah, yay, we were able to get to most of those. All right, I'm going to wrap us up, folks. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Matt, for taking us through a pretty complicated and weighty topic. And again, the resources that we mentioned in today's discussion have been placed in the chat. They're also on our website. And please email us if there's something you see we need to fix in one of our guides or resources. Please let us know. And let us know if there are other topics or ways that we can support you over the coming couple of months. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time.